Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have a Hodge-Podge episode. I put together a bunch of questions for John and I'm just going to throw them at him rapid fire. Are you ready, John? But first, how are you?
Well, I'm not ready for that. That's always throws me for a curve. That's a loop right there. No, I'm good, fairly good, all things considered. How are you? How's the heat in Texas?
Like 1,000,000 degrees, but it's sprinkled a little bit today. So at 11:20 p.m., it's still 84 degrees here.
Wow. It's been beautiful in LA the last couple weeks.
What's
not the brag.
Temperature right now?
Right now it's in the 70s.
Oh my God.
It's at night, sunset, so 9:18. What is it right now? We're gonna look at the app programmed over my location. Weather. Nope, that's not weather. Slowing. Okay, right now it is 72 degrees.
Oh my goodness, I'm so jealous. Y'all are 12 degrees less than us, and the sun is still out.
It got hot during the day up to 90, but it didn't feel that bad.
Oh, it was 106 here today.
Oh, that's unbearable. That's it's really like living in New Delhi.
You don't want to leave the domicile whenever it's like that.
Now wait till the power goes out.
Oh God, knock wood. We've avoided that so far.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm just planting the seed.
Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah.
Mother Nature, don't listen to him. Okay, so let's jump right in here. And the first thing I want to talk to you about are sponsor deals. Specifically, the UFC sponsor deals with Crypto or Monster or the Rock shoes. I think it's called the Rock Collective or something along those lines. But Tanner Boser released a video and he just went off on the sponsors that don't pay me a fucking dime. And the thing is if I am to understand correctly, judging by your tweets, it's not really on those sponsors, it's on the UFC.
I mean, yeah, technically, yeah. We've talked about this in the past a couple times. I think the UFC contract sponsors. To go over it again, though, the UFC's deal, the way they have their contract structure with fighters now is the fighters have no rights to sponsorship at all. They have none. No right to wear a sponsor in the cage like they used to be able to do. They have no right to wear sponsors during the week before, during any UFC event, and that includes the week before the lead up to the fight week. They don't have rights to sponsors, but they have what's called they have to wear the uniform they're given, the kit, the Reebok kit, right?
Venom
and they have
kit.
That kit's what's that?
It's a Venom kit now. No more Reebok.
Venom. Yes, but whatever. It's some sort of outfit they wear. Yeah, but on it can be logos of other sponsors, right? And they also have to wear now the I think they're like sandals or something from The Rock, not his shoes. I can't remember what footwear they have to wear on the walkout, but it's The Rock, man. It's his brand. But all that's part of the outfitter kit, outfitter policy. And the UFC fighters are compensated, and I use little air quotes there, they're compensated by the UFC for complying with all the requirements of the week to get that pay. So they're not, originally when it was introduced with the Reebok kit, and everybody assumed imagines that's the pay you get for wearing the Reebok kit for Reebok, right? But no, really what they're paying you is they're paying you as a bonus for complying with all the rules during fight week, which means wearing all the stuff they tell you to wear, showing up and signing the autographs. They tell all the stuff you're supposed to do during fight week, the press, you do all that, you get that payment. And that's all bundled together for that. And so the UFC, they can collect all the sponsor money from the individual, from the whoever does the outfit, from the shoes, from the logos they put on the outfits. All that goes to the UFC, and the UFC pays it out to the fighters. Now, the complaint that he has towards some of the sponsors, it should mostly be directed to the UFC. But when the sponsors sign these deals with the UFC, often they'll sit down and say, here's the percent we want to use to go to the fighters for certain sponsorship deals and stuff that we want the fighters. Like if we came in, let's say we wanted to be sponsors for Bloody Elbow, and the UFC would never take us, but let's say they did. And we go, we want to give you $100 million a year so we could have our logo on the cage. But 80% of the money we're going to pay you for having our brand there. But the other 20%, we want to have go to fighters, and we want those fighters to show up and do certain things with, either wear the UFC, the Bloody Elbow logo, or show up to events and support a Bloody Elbow. And so we could put that in the contract, but who controls that money? Still, the UFC decides what fighters get it.
Wait, so it's subjective then?
Well, somewhat subjective. In this situation, on the outfitting kits, the contracts probably state that all the money is going to the UFC. There might be separate deals. Like The Rock shoes, he might have a deal where portions of the money he wants certain fighters to get to be spokespeople for it. And so they'll select certain fighters. They'll do individual ads for The Rock's footwear or show up at events wearing Rock footwear to advertise it, and they'll get some money. But this helps UFC because the sponsors might ask for a fighter, but it's up to the UFC if the fighter's going to be picked for that particular sponsorship, right? And so my understanding is what often happens is the people that deal with the client, the sponsor that contacts the UFC, makes the deal, they then go to, they have to go up to Dana White or one of the main guys and say, here's who we want to use. Here's who the sponsor wants to use as one of the fighters to represent their product from the UFC. And then Dana White he says yes or no. Is he in good with the UFC or no? Has he signed up his contract? We in negotiation with them? Yes or no? And then based on what Dana White says, then they can go to that fighter and say, hey, here's a deal. Do you want to show up at this event? Or do you want to have this extra logo? Do you want to be in a press marketing campaign or in a commercial for this sponsor? We'll pay you this amount of money.
All right. Question. Has the amount of showing up and doing things pay increased any since we first saw it roll out with the Reebok deal?
Well, they did have an increase. What was it, a year ago? For the bottom guys, more from the top. I can't remember. I think it's like 4,000 it starts at instead of 2,500 for the people for the fight week compliance. So it's gone up a little bit, but not a lot.
But at the top end is what I'm looking at.
I think the top guys are still at 40,000.
So that's the most you can make.
That is the most you can make. Yes.
But you 40,000. Are wearing kind of big sponsors. Like we go back to the golden age of sponsorship, the golden age before the sponsor tax. You would see guys making threefold what their purses were, fourfold what their purses were.
Oh, yeah. No, I shouldn't say for most part. For the top fighters, it is we've already talked about it, it's a huge decrease in their pay from sponsorship. Right. And also hurts them on their outside the cage sponsors because, who wants to be a sponsor if you're going to sponsor, be an energy drink and you want to get a UFC fighter as a sponsor, who wants to sponsor you when the UFC can use your image in all the ads for their energy drinks that their sponsors are, right? So there's a big conflict there, much more than other sports, because UFC has access to the rights to your image in so many different places. So it limits your sponsorship outside the cage. And so a lot of fighters, the top guys who used to make $100,000, $200,000 in sponsorship and sometimes, in huge amounts outside the cage, they've lost tons of money from the sponsorship. Now, the bottom guys that could never get sponsorship, they might be doing a little better. The very guy in the bottom prelims, because they're getting some money here that before they couldn't get any. And there's a group of fighters in the mid range, I guess 500, let's say 500 fighters, guys that win, lose, but hang around the UFC for a while. They're doing better because they couldn't get sponsorship before because they weren't really known fighters. But now the UFC, because they've been around, they can send them out to these events or give them to some of the vendors to be the person that's going to get the sponsorship money for being a company man. And so they do better. And often those guys are in certain territories where the UFC is trying to push to keep those fighters happy. That way they can, like if you're in the Europe, so a typical American fighter probably doesn't have access to a lot of that sponsor dollar, but someone in, let's say, Australia or China or the China probably, some of the fighters get much bigger local endorsement sponsorship, but, or Europe and certain countries can probably get more money from the UFC for those deals than other fighters. But for the vast majority, I should say, especially for the top guys, for the vast majority of the top guys, we're going to talk about boxing later, I'm sure. Spence Crawford, we'll get in that later, but all those logos you see in the cage on the ring come next Saturday, they're getting a piece of all that. And that's not how it works in MMA.
let's talk about the quality of sponsor, because again, I'm going to go back for a moment to the golden age, and you would see some random watch sponsor and some local tire sponsor or local dealership. You would just see the most random collection. But now the UFC has eliminated all that. You have to, just take what you're given through the Venom deal, whatever, the go out on the road and sign posters deal. But what about the UFC sponsors? Because they're not exactly blue chip.
Yeah, they are not. In fact, UFC for a long time strove to improve the quality of their sponsorship and would turn down a lot of sponsorships under the Fertittas, to get major beer. What Budweiser was it Budweiser for a long time?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Bud Light, it was actually Bud Light.
Bud Light, you're right.
Bud
Yes,
Light
the famous
Burger
Brock
King.
Lesnar. Yeah. I drink Coors. Wasn't that his comment?
Yeah, he drinks Coors, but they had Bud Light. But their other big blue chip was Burger King.
Yeah, that Burger King. But they were out trying to get major sponsorship. And after Endeavor took over, they made a strategic decision that they were not shooting for the A-list sponsors anymore because they were too hard to get. And the A-list were very hesitant being attached to MMA and UFC, and they weren't going to pay as much. And they started going after, it started when, Dana White spoke at the Republican convention in 2016. A lot of fighters were publicly, conservative in the UFC, and they noticed Endeavor made this strategic decision. They started going after B, C tier sponsorship, often run by conservatives, because they knew they were easier to get and get more, and those guys were willing to pay more because they were getting access to what they viewed as a major sport, and they could never get into the NBA, NFL, any of those. And so they strategically started going after these lower tier, people told me tier C, they call them. I mean, the UFC people behind us they're open-eyed. They know what they're doing. They're realistic about it. But they went and got tons of these and they filled the cage up. And these are the type of sponsors because they're so happy just to be in the UFC because they have access to a limited amount of sports they can be in. You can start stacking them up and have sponsors that are almost identical. They slightly different. This is they have an energy drink and a power drink or some ridiculous thing. They have a whiskey and a mixed drink and a vodka and a flavored vodka. Don't they? I mean, they have like tons of brands that are almost identical categories covering the cage, people's names, but they did that intentionally. They went out and got, plus sponsors that a lot of other, weird cryptocurrency stuff that other sports would probably stay away from. And so that was their intentional plan. And they've gone out and got that. They've racked up huge amounts of sponsorship dollars because of that. But but again, this is the UFC going after all these sponsors, gathering them up. And it's not, the fighters are not getting, they used to say we got to clean up. We can't have a condom depot in the UFC. We have
Trojan now because they had Trojan in the cage just this past weekend.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are some embarrassing sponsorship they have now, but they don't care because they're here to make as much. And I can't argue that's the fight business, make as much money as possible. But before, when they're saying they're trying to clean up the sport, that was, people might have believed it, but that was obviously a lie. The whole point was they want to make sure. The whole point with getting rid of the fighters sponsorship is because that way there's no competition for what the UFC can sell. Because now the people that want to put brands in the UFC can't go to the fighters and get a cheaper deal. The only person they can talk to about getting their brand in the octagon is with the UFC.
And now, these days, you can actually pay to have your own name on that octagon canvas. They have monetized every single molecule that they can.
I'm so glad they cleaned up the cage. It's so much cleaner and tidier looking now.
I can't imagine anywhere else they can squeeze money out of. But I'm sure you'll be able to tell me something.
Oh, yeah, they have plans. I guess they have talked. They have several sponsorship deals that they haven't tapped into. They think, I can't remember. There was a list of certain categories they're going to go for that they don't have yet.
Oh my!
And so they got to push for those. They're going to push to re-up or. They're also I think they're pushing for certain premium events to up the charge, so like they're probably not including Conor fights in all the deals now. Now, if you want to be in the cage when Conor fights, you have to pay extra.
Would that also apply to someone like John Jones?
It probably, I don't know the full details yet, but they are trying to, or maybe they're carving out certain spaces. I don't know the full detail, but they want to carve out some of the bigger events because they want those to be premium and get more dollars from other sell them to other sponsors that might be interested in the bigger events.
Now, does Bellator or PFL or One or Ryzen, any of those, the bigger ones, and those are our big four, do they have sponsor taxes or anything approaching the way the UFC does their sponsor business?
Well, Ryzen's a little different. Ryzen events don't have much sponsorship in the cage.
Yeah.
And it's just Japanese, a different business. I remember talking to some people about that. They keep it clean. They have certain sponsors for the event, usually on TV. But it's interesting because fighters make a lot in sponsorship in Japan. Like their purses in boxing too, like boxing purses might not be as high in Japan normally. If we talk about Fulton later in Inoue, that's a little different. But normally the purses are little because they don't make as much on the TV rights or the gate. They can make some, but there's not as many big gates in Japan. But they make a fortune in sponsorship. The fighters do. And if you're a Western fighter and you come to Japan and become popular, you can make a lot of money in sponsorship. So there's a lot of fighters that are making just a ton of money in sponsorship in Japan. So it's a little different. So the fact that they don't have it in the cage doesn't hurt, or doesn't have it in the ring doesn't hurt the fighters as much because there's so much, I guess the fan base is so much more, follows the fighters more there or something. I don't know why. I'm not in depth knowledge of the Japanese market, but that seems to be the case. For PFL, they almost have an identical thing to the UFC. Remember they have uniforms, do they not?
Yes,
yes,
PFL
for their
does.
fighters. So
yes.
They've done the same program as the UFC, where one I'm not as familiar with. I don't know the full detail. I know they have a lot of the same rules as the UFC and PFL on the right to have sponsorship. The one has complete control over it. But PFL is very much almost identical to the UFC. But I don't know if they pay there's no bonus pay that I remember going through that contract with you. I got to recall. I don't think there was
there wasn't.
Venom deal bonus. So it's not as good right there, right? Now, Bellator is probably the most old fashioned. They have the right to ban any sponsor. You have to get approval for all of them. But it's the old school that you are allowed to have your old sponsors. The problem is if you're not getting the ratings on Bellator like you used to with the UFC, you're not going to get as much sponsorship. So select fighters probably do well. But other fighters, and with PFL, Ngannou, I got a feeling is going to make a fortune in sponsorship because they've carved out that he's allowed to have his own sponsorship. We've talked about that. You had an interview with his manager, I think, talking about that.
Yep.
So he's going to carve out his own sponsorship, and he's got so much attention now that even the PFL not getting the ratings UFC, he's just going to get a lot of money because his profile is ready to skyrocket with the upcoming Fury fight.
All right, let's cruise into some more fuckery and let's talk about Ari Emmanuel, specifically his involvement in the SAG-AFTRA strike and how differently he is treating the actors he represents from the fighters over here in the UFC, which is actually the big breadwinner of Endeavor.
Yeah, this was talked on Freakonomics a while ago as we go through. I think there's a buffet of choices of questions we're going to go through here today, it sounds like. So,
yes.
But for this one, it's Freakonomics. They mentioned it. And it was infuriating because they mentioned it in a portion of the show when they weren't talking to Ari instead of bringing it up to him, because this would be something interesting to bring up for him to talk about. But Endeavor, they're one of the major talent agencies, right? And they represent major A-list actors and directors, and they're out there trying to get them the biggest deals possible. And they claim they're in support of the strike, although they're actually in between. They're on the side of their talent at the same time, but they also are a producer of product. So I think they're just as much on the side of the producers as well, the Association of Motion Picture Studios. But that's there's some conflicts of interest, and a lot of actors and filmmakers are aware of this. But they are often out there trying to get the best deal possible for their talent, like The Rock, as much money as possible. And they also represent a lot of pro athletes. football players, basketball, and baseball, where they're out there trying to get as much money as possible for those guys and are standing up to the owners. Now, when they deal with the UFC and WWE, they have the opposite position. They own the sport. So where other sports athletes, where they can get them a lot of money, they represent the athletes and try to get them as much money as possible. But in a sport like bull riding, the fake sport of professional wrestling, and then UFC, where they can control the whole sport, instead of representing the athletes, they buy the sport and then try to limit pay as much as possible. So there is some there's a dichotomy there that's a little interesting, I guess you could say.
All right, with Ari, since he represents The Rock, as you mentioned, and The Rock has shoes inside the UFC, I have a question here.
Yes.
Is there any probability that maybe The Rock isn't paying as much to the UFC for those shoes to be on those feet? Because he is maybe there's some trade going on there, I don't know how that works. I'm just curious about that.
I mean, it's a possibility considering they're partners, and they could be like, well, we're going to cut you a deal, and this is a mutual beneficial agreement. We will give you a deal with the UFC. You can pay this much. Maybe we'll give you, here's the competition bidding. We'll agree to yours for slightly less for this deal, because we want to nurture this project with you, because we have future projects and we're going to get a piece of it. And for all we know, and I mean, I don't know, maybe deep within the books, Endeavor might have a piece of this.
That was going to be my next question: is could Endeavor have a piece of those shoes? Because that seems to be a real sticking point with a lot of the athletes, and it's the most curious sponsorship to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible they have they have a finder's fee for making the connections and stuff. So there's a possibility that they have an interest in making the deal for him, because they have a finder's fee commission that comes with making the deal. And so that's, they can double bill that way. So there's just multiple ways this could be working out. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, they had an announcement that ESPN is talking to the NBA and NFL about giving them equity, part ownership of the network, to sign with them for less money because they're paying so much out in rights fees, right? Well, that could be great for the NBA and NFL, because the owners then would own a piece of ESPN, and as ESPN's value increased, they would get more. Their value, their net worth would increase. But for like the NFL, the players, there's going to be some discussions about what piece of equity do we get, because our collective bargaining agreement calls for us to get a portion of the revenue, and we get paid based on that portion of the revenue. And the biggest piece of revenue we get is the TV deals we sign. And so it's in our interest for you guys to go out and get the biggest TV deal possible. And if you're out cutting deals that are smaller than the biggest TV possible because you get equity, that hurts us. And so in many ways, that's kind of you could say the same with the UFC. The fighters, even though the promoters have no fiduciary responsibility to the fighters, the idea of the fighters is like, well, you're giving up, let's say, a sponsor that was willing to pay us, and these Reebok kits, or pay us more, for one that's not, because you get a commission for signing the deal and you get more revenue. So, it's again, the UFC, it's interesting because Endeavor is really strong advocates for their clients when they're high paid athletes in other sports. But they're the exact opposite when they're dealing with their own athletes in the sports that they control.
Let's talk about Bob Iger for a second. Bob Iger is the CEO of Disney, and Disney owns ESPN and they own ABC News. I know they don't own ABC outright, but they own a significant portion of it. Why is he so important here, though? Because I saw a podcast on YouTube, and they were talking about this tech retreat that Bob Iger went on a week and a half or so ago, and how he was basically chopping up Disney properties for like a fire sale of sorts. But one thing that caught my interest was they talked about Bob Iger saying that he wanted to, quote, find a partner for ESPN. What the heck does that mean? And how integral is Bob Iger to UFC operations, if at all?
Well, first of all, I think Disney does own ABC still. I think it was Fox that they got a portion of,
Oh,
because
okay.
remember the whole Fox deal where they bought
Yeah.
20th Century Fox, and the Murdochs kept the news side of it, but got rid of the film and a lot of the entertainment side. That's why how Disney Plus now has The Simpsons, and the FX channel is on Disney. So Disney, yeah, they own a lot of stuff. It's sad because now we're going to go on a tangent a little bit, because I'm in the entertainment industry, and this is something I've been bitching about for well over a decade. People on Twitter might know about my hostility to the studio system, the way it works. Fox, everybody goes nuts for Bob Iger. He is one of the people that put the studio system in the problem they're at, because in their attempt to make sure that movies never lost money, because that's one of the problems with film, is there's a risk and no one wants to lose money. And so Disney had the genius idea, we're going to have no risk. And so we started making just Marvel movies, Star Wars movies, and remakes of Disney brands, right? So every movie was a guaranteed built-in audience and would never lose money. But what they did is, because those movies were so popular, and that's a problem with the audience, and where they didn't want to take risky film, but they had the leverage too, because those movies are so popular and they had so many of them, they could say, you have to give up screen space, right, to our big movies. Our Star Wars movies are every year you have to give up tons of screen space, or our Marvel movies, and they could hog up huge chunks, the multiplexes. So if you wanted to go see a movie, often you couldn't, because they would be taking up all the screens, pushing out smaller movies that needed more time. On top of that, they were spending all the all the advertising money. So the only movies you were aware of were their movies. And so people that liked more, old fashioned type movies of different genres, they no longer were in the habit going to the movie, because they got sick of these types of movies. So Disney was making a fortune, but they were killing the rest of the industry. And now that their movies look like they might be struggling, now they're like, oh, the industry's got to change. No, you salted the industry. You're the guy that did all this. Mm-hmm. So that's my pet peeve on it. That's my rant towards Bob Iger, and other things too. He screws over actors. He caved into China. And that's part of the reason the film industry is so bad, is because we were making movies for China more than America. Just on and on about that guy. And now that I've gone through the rant, I forgot what even the question was.
Oh, the question is about finding a partner for ESPN, because he was quoted as having said that, and about shaving off pieces of Disney for sale. Basically, yeah. I want to know how important he is or isn't to UFC operations. Like, does he have any sway? Like, could he come down and say something and the UFC would have to acquiesce?
Oh yeah, he has a lot of power, because he dictates stuff, and his, it's a little scary. And again, because of the way they ran the industry, and because they went so much into streaming, they basically killed the terrestrial services. They could have gone much longer than they did. So yeah, the ABC channel might get rid of, the Disney cable channel they might drop, a bunch of stuff they consider there's no growth margin for. They're looking for stuff in the future that will grow. And so they want to dump those. For ESPN, the cost is that the cost of sports has risen so much that they just can't keep up. It makes it hard to make it affordable. So they have, on one hand, they have people cutting cords. So you're not making all the money you made, and cable actually paid more, they now realize, than streaming does. They're losing all the cord cutters, but the streaming service, again, like I said, isn't paying as much, isn't making them as much. So, but what the big major sports is asking for is so much, they don't know how they can possibly afford it. So the question is, this is where this could come back and kind of hurt the UFC. The UFC they basically want 1.5 to 2 times or more what they're getting right now on their next deal, right? This current deal pays, I think, with the pay-per-view deal and the streaming, about $500 million a year. So you're talking about $750 to $1 billion a year they want from the American domestic streaming and broadcast. Well, that might be too much for ESPN. Up till now, I know that ESPN has been very happy with the pay-per-view deal. They've been making money. But if you double the price you're asking for that, I don't know if that's a money-making deal. And so for Endeavor, they got to worry about, is ESPN going to match their price? Of course, they're obviously making, they've alluded that they can go to Amazon or some other streamer. We'll have to wait and see. But for ESPN, the partner I think they're talking about is basically bringing on the major sports teams, leagues, and saying, we're going to bring you on as a partner. We'll pay you less and give you equity, but that way to make it more affordable for broadcasting a major sport.
Wow. All right. I'm going to divert again to a new topic. I need to know which fighters, if any, do you think could make it outside the octagon the way Francis did? And you cannot say Conor McGregor. Has to be anybody besides Conor. We already know Conor could write his own deal on the outside. I want to know if there's anybody else that could even approach what Francis did.
Well, approach is that's the hard part. Approaching it's going to be very difficult for anybody else. Man, we're going just curves left and right. Every one question's a completely different direction, throwing me off here. But for this one, yeah. I mean, if someone, first of all, to exit the octagon, I'm going to imagine that they can also fight MMA instead of just boxing, because only a select group of fighters can really go into boxing and make money and make serious money. And that was, Nate Diaz can do it because there was always been talk of him fighting Jake Paul. There seems to be interest in there. McGregor could do it. And Ngannou, all that stuff is not being orchestrated and the audience isn't being manipulated. There seems to be some interest in the public themselves for those fights happening, those boxing matches. That's why Usman, there was no interest in seeing him versus Canelo because the public had no interest in that fight. So very select fight. I can't imagine any other fighters that could leave the UFC and have success in boxing, except for maybe, Jorge Masvidal, but I think his moment has passed. I don't think he could do that anymore. And like I said, you can't bring up Conor, but but if people could get out of their contracts right now and leave the UFC, who could find success? I think the number one would be John Jones.
Okay.
Because yes, there's not many promotions. There's no one like the UFC, but there is Francis Ngannou out there. And everybody I've talked to think that's a massive fight, UFC involvement or not, that you could put that on without the UFC and still sell just an absolute ton of pay-per-views and pay both those guys the Deontay Wilder money that John Jones was asking for a while ago. And of course they would negotiate the two would have to negotiate a boxing deal, which I imagine they would, where they get almost all the revenue, that the promoter gets a very small cut of it and they get to keep most of it. He's one for sure. The other one I'm going to throw for a curve, I think 135 pounders could do good. And that's Sean O'Malley and Aljamain Sterling. In some ways, Aljamain Sterling better because I don't think Aljamain's not like a major draw, but he's leaked what he makes in the UFC. Didn't he say he makes like $400,000, $500,000 as a champ in that ballpark?
Yep.
Plus pay-per-view. But pay-per-view kicks in at like 200,000 and the most he ever sold was like 250,000. So he's not making outrageous amounts of money. If he left, yes, he's not a major star, but if he could just walk out of the UFC while still the champ, if he hasn't lost the belt and, just threw it back to the UFC, I could imagine, even though Bellator, their financial problems are going to be bought by someone else, a Bellator with their roster, he's the type of fighter, when you look at what they pay their fighters, 3-4 times what he's currently getting is not outrageous. Maybe even, $2 million or more while he's still the number one guy at 135 does not seem like a ridiculous amount he could get paid, which is, it's not Ngannou money, but it's better than what he's getting.
I'm going to ask you two names because these were the two names that popped into my head. Israel Adesanya.
Yeah, Israel's a little harder because he does get a pretty high paycheck for MMA from the UFC while champ. And I think his base started like 4 or 5 million guaranteed. And then, a lot of pay-per-view sales can go up to 6 or 7 million. That's the word on the street. The problem is there's no opponent in him in boxing. There's no interest in him to go box, right? And so you can't do that. And he's making that much in the UFC, but there's no opponents outside the UFC you could really sell. Okay. And so that would be a problem. In fact, in some ways, I think like a Volkanovski you'd have a better option with him because I don't know what his new deal, but what his deal was before. You could imagine him going into Australia, holding an event, and keeping the gate and keeping the Australian pay-per-view for himself, making more there than he would in the UFC. But for Adesanya, it's without the opponents, there's just no one outside the UFC I can imagine drawing that well enough that would make it worthwhile.
Okay. Well, All right. My other one is way out of left field and very, very likely to never happen. But if she were to come back, would Ronda Rousey be able to do something on the outside? Like if she were to come back to MMA and she shopped around, would she be able to do as well?
Yeah, for one simple fact, I think you could still put on a Cyborg fight.
Okay.
And I don't think it would sell as well as it would a few years ago. I mean, maybe it would, because you never know. Things just take off, the weight. I mean, but you went off on 2 losses. So the best would be bring her back, throw her in against someone she could beat, and then book the Cyborg fight. But I imagine if you could probably sell a Cyborg fight against her now and then do well enough that she would make as much, if not more, outside the UFC. Now, if we had done, if during the peak of her fame, and she just walked out of the UFC and went and fought, her and Cyborg met somewhere to fight, I think she would have made a lot more.
All right. Now, Sean Strickland did an interview just a couple of days ago with Helen Yee, and he made a really valid point that title challengers don't make shit. And I quote, maybe enough for a lift kit for a truck or enough to upgrade a Hyundai Accent. It is not LeBron James money, he said. I want you to talk a little bit about that misconception that if you are a title challenger and you're in there fighting for a belt and you're not holding that belt, that one, you just automatically get a gigantic purse. And 2, you automatically get points because you're in a title fight. So many people believe that.
Yeah, most fighters don't. There's a select few. Like when George St. Pierre came back to fight Bisping, he got pay-per-view, right? When if Conor McGregor came back after dropping the belt to fight Khabib, he got pay-per-view points. But you're talking about just a select handful of fighters that get pay-per-views but not champs, or just pay-per-views in general, like Nate Diaz when he's in a main event. Nate Diaz doesn't always get pay-per-views, but when he's in the main event of a card, he gets pay-per-view points. But everybody, because just a select few fighters get pay-per-views basically no matter what. Everybody assumes that it's very common. And no, you're talking about like 5-6 fighters total. They might not even fight some years. So the vast majority of the way the contracts work is you're on your normal contract. Usually when you get into the position where you're a challenger, your new contract will work like a typical contract, like $75,000 a show and $75,000 to win. But it'll have a section, and when you fight for a title, your pay will jump up. A good example of that is in Francis Ngannou. His pay jumped up to $500,000 when he challenged for the title. Both times it went up to $500,000. So he was getting 100 and 100 on his basic contract, or 500 or 600,000. It might have been 600,000 against Stipe when he fought him the second time. He started out at 100,000 to show, 100,000 bonus to win, and then every time he won, it went up 10,000. But when he fought for the title, it was at 600,000, I believe. It jumped up to 600,000, but he didn't get pay-per-views. When you're defending champion, the contract will stay. You get pay-per-view points. So for someone like at middleweight, Strickland, he might have his contract that pays his show, his normal, guaranteed amount, and then his bonus, and then it might jump up to 250, 300, 350,000, maybe 400,000 max for someone like him, I'm imagining. Typically, that's how it works. And then, but no bonus. If he wins, the UFC usually gives $100,000 bonus for winning when you're not the champion. But other than that, no money. So compared to most fighters, they're probably thinking, "Oh, Sean's doing good, making several $100,000 on this fight." But it's a pretty big fight.
But is he making several $100,000? Because not all title challengers are the same.
Not all are. Nope. There's a chance he's not, but I am guessing he's going to get in that ballpark, or that's what he's asking for. But even that's still not much. I mean, first of all, it's not, when we say how much a fighter is making, that's not net. That's gross. They're small businesses.
Yeah.
They got to pay for their training. They got to pay for their management. They got to pay for all the little stuff that goes with it. So you're talking about a third of their paycheck's gone, and then they got taxes on that. So they're not, that's not net. He's not getting that. He's getting less than that. And that's gross, not net. So he's getting less than that. And then again, that's when he's at the peak of his possible earning potential. The highest he's ever been as a fighter. You were one of 2 people fighting for a title on an event that the UFC is guaranteed as a pay-per-view to get like 17 million from ESPN from. And so you would imagine, in the way things work, if they're getting that much money, you as a fighter should get a percentage, at least like several million. If this was boxing, he could guarantee himself several million.
Now, when I say that all title challengers are not the same, is it fair to assume that smaller title challengers, smaller in weight, make less?
Oh, typically, yeah, you can look at it. Typically, it goes like, I don't know what the standard is now, but you fight for a title at like flyweight 125, 135. You're getting 250 as your base pay.
Why is Henry Cejudo so different?
How is he so different from what?
Because when he fought DJ.
Oh yeah, this was how long ago was this?
Well, that was what, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But the point is, everybody was already making 250 by then. But DJ of all, Cejudo of all people, gold medalists, and just came in with so much hype, and he won, and he did it all for 100,000. How did that happen? Why?
Well, I think he got talked in by his management. Here's your big shot. Take it. This is the only way to get the title fight is by not asking for anything more, and the UFC will reward you later.
And who's his management again?
Well, his famed UFC broker is Ali Abdelaziz. So now, often like Dan Hardy he was paid $24,000 and $24,000 back in 2010 or 2011 to fight George St. Pierre.
It was actually 2009.
No, it was actually 2009 was UFC 100. It was the year after that, 2010.
2010. Okay.
Yes. Okay. But he got 24. No, he actually got more than that. The UFC paid him like 100,000 under the table afterwards. But even then, $124,000 for a fight where he's in the main event on a card that the UFC made. We know how much they made. It's in the lawsuit. They made $28 million on that card.
Wow.
And he got $124,000. And so now they're paying fighters more as challengers now than they were back then. But considering how much more the UFC is making, I don't know. And considering how much I think a fighter, even a challenger, how much I'm watching the event to see them. I don't know about the rest of the people. Maybe all of you are tuning in to see Joe Rogan and you love the logo on the cage and the 8 sides. You get busy counting the 8 sides every night, and that's why you're watching. But I'm there to watch specific fighters, and I'm always floored that the money I'm paying, either through the advertising they collect because I'm watching or the pay-per-view I'm buying, that a very, very small percentage is going to who I'm actually paying to see.
Wow. All right, so we are going to do one last lane change, and we're going to start talking boxing to wrap this up. So I have a few questions for you. And my first one is, do you think Spence Crawford will beat, tie, or they won't at all come close to the numbers that Tank and Ryan Garcia put up?
It's going to be hard for them to do the total numbers that, especially in pay-per-view, that Ryan and Davis did. But I think it's gonna do super well. I mean, I know that some people are tracking the ticket prices, and it's set to do a very similar gate, over 20 million. Tank Davis and Ryan Garcia, I think, did 23 million or just under 23 million. And this is in that same ballpark. So it's going to do almost identical gate. It looks like it's going to be a sellout. Tracking it like Google Trends and stuff, you notice that it's doing almost identical trends. People are looking it up the same amount. It's their interest, maybe slightly less. So my guess is it does excellent numbers, incredible numbers, but maybe just a little bit less. I'm going to say it does not break 1 million buys in the U.S. with over 900,000, which is in today's age, that's a tremendous amount of pay-per-view sales.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about site fees. I've always been curious about how they work in the United States. I know when we go outside the United States, specifically like Saudi Arabia is throwing all kinds of money for site fees. We saw that with Andy Ruiz and Anthony Joshua, the second fight. We saw them get crazy. That site fee was like, what, 70 million? Wasn't it?
No, I think it was actually less than that. I mean, they said that it was 70 million for the first Andy Ruiz.
No, the second one.
I mean, the second fight, but the
Yeah.
first Saudi Arabia fight by Joshua.
Yeah.
Which was the second. So this gets confusing. The second Andy Ruiz fight, but it was the first fight in Saudi Arabia. They said, but if you look at the Matchroom's finances, you'll see that that year that they had a huge jump in worldwide revenues. You got to imagine that's the Saudi site fee money, and I think it ended up being like probably around a little over 50 million. So a huge site fee.
Yeah.
But not the numbers that were being thrown around.
Okay. But how do they work in the United States? Are there site fees in the United States? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. I mean, there used to be a lot more common in Vegas for big boxing matches because the casinos would offer a large payment to hold the right to hold the event. The promoter would take it because then they'd have to do no work. They wouldn't have to sell tickets. They wouldn't have to do advertising for that. That was all in the casino. The casino then often pay more than what the tickets would sell because their whole goal was to get people at the casino gambling. They would be looking at the whole weekend of activities and see that they would make money that way. So for the promoters, it was a smart decision because you could make more than what the tickets were actually selling for by doing that and less effort. Now, Floyd Mayweather famously would not take the site fee because he knew he could charge so much for his tickets and premium and also negotiate with the stadium that he got a piece of the commission. You know, famously he got a bite of every hot dog and beer sold because they could jack up the price during his events and he could get a cut of that. So he could make a fortune on the location. So he wouldn't take a site fee, but you still see him. Utah paid a site fee to bring the UFC there, the Salt Lake City. It's more common internationally. They report on it. The UFC in their endeavor and their finances, their SEC filings talk about that they look at site fees overseas and they think they can make large amount. Like they had a huge site fee in London. They get a lot of Australia, the Australia Tourism Board. They get big site fees there, and I think in United Arab Emirates, all their fights there are site fees because they're using it to advertise the location, and I don't think there's a big natural fight fan base there, and I don't think a lot of people are really traveling to the Middle East to watch fights, so they need that large lump sum. But yeah, the whole point of a site fee is that you are paying for the right to have the event. You want to bring them to your location. Now, some site fees too, you could pay the UFC or another promoter a site fee to bring the event, and they could still keep the tickets. But usually when you're paying for it, you're paying for them to hold the event in your place, and you're the one that'll sell the tickets. You're basically taking all the risk away from them. But the UFC has done this too before, where they got paid a site fee for bringing it. I think to Australia, this is how it worked the last time. They got a site fee for bringing the show to Australia, and they also got to collect the ticket revenue.
Wow. Okay, what will Saudi Arabia, if in your estimate, end up paying out when it's all said and done for Ngannou Fury, if you were to guesstimate?
I mean, it's really hard to guesstimate. I mean, just talk to people, though. It's a large sum. Fury's saying he's making is more in this than any fight possible. I find that incredibly hard to believe because every word they're offering just an enormous fortune to him to fight Usyk, and I don't think they're offering him as much Ngannou. But for the risk involved, it sounds absurd, but they've upped the amount they're offering from the previous. Every time they've done these fights in Saudi Arabia, the amount has gone up. The first site fee with Ruiz was supposedly around 50 million. It was several 10, 20 million more than that for the Usyk Joshua fight. So I'm just on pure guess, it's in the 60, 70 million range, I'm guessing, with Fury getting 70% of it. More than that, maybe. I'm going to say if you're going to give Ngannou 20 million, let's say, and you're going to give Fury about 50 million minimum.
Wow. Does Saudi Arabia cover anything beyond the site fees?
Well, the last time they negotiated, they kept, and they did this with they got a big chunk of the Jake Paul Tommy Fury fight, is they got a lot of the broadcast rights. The first time they had Joshua there, they basically didn't ask for any of the broadcast rights. They just paid for the site fee. And I think they realized, well, we're paying all this amount of money for this, but we're not getting any return on all the other revenue sources. So they're paying larger site fees now but they either are taking control of the broadcast rights, selling themselves and controlling them, or getting a piece of the broadcast rights. So I got a feeling that I don't know the full details. We haven't heard anything yet, but I got a feeling that Saudi Arabia is going to get a piece of the pay-per-view revenue when this is said and done. But who knows for sure? Maybe they're just paying one large sum to have it there, and all the other revenue is going to be kept for the promotions and boxers. But from what I understand, Ngannou doesn't get an upside; he's just getting a lump sum. And I think it's about 20 million, but who knows? I mean, there was talk before that he was asking for 30 million, so maybe that's what he's getting. But he's getting a lump sum, and but the Saudis will keep all the revenue.
Final question, and it's going to circle us right back to UFC to close out the show. Is there anything in the UFC contract that dictates purse payouts or any form of compensation for a fighter when their fights are canceled within 24 hours of fight day?
No. In fact, there's an explicit stuff in the contract that say if something happens to the fight, they don't have to pay you.
Really?
Now, yeah, I mean, the one caveat, and all of them have this, there's something gross negligent by the promoter, right? Uh-huh. If the promoter does some grossly negligent, then they have a state where the promoter will probably have to pay you your base pay, not your win bonus. But I'm trying to think what would be the gross negligence. Let's say if they had an event and the promoter accidentally booked the challenger in the wrong city, some that ridiculously incompetent, then you might have a case where like you got to pay me because you're the one that made this incredible mistake. You know, it's within your control. You're the one that drove me to the wrong arena, your people, something like that. Then you could have a case where you could say you have to pay me. But in the contracts, it says if for any reason, if the opponent's injured, if he's sick, if act of God, anything like that, if all these long list of reasons why the fight gets canceled, they just have to rebook the fight. They don't have to compensate you at all.
Wow. So why do they in the instances that they do?
Well, I think to keep the roster happy. Okay. I mean, the UFC has so much money, it doesn't matter to them. And in the grand scheme of things, they're not paying the fighter. It doesn't cost them much to pay the fighter a little bit, right? It goes a long way. Doing a little bit now goes a long way to keeping the fighters happy and not complaining down the line.
Wow. All right. So the UFC is actually being a little bit okay, but for a totally calculated reason.
Oh yeah, I mean, for a lot of fighters, I mean, actually being in the UFC is a net positive compared to where they could be, and that's one thing you got to remember. The UFC has so much money that they're paying more than anybody else for the caliber of fighter that we're talking about.
You're using the word "more" in heavy quotes, right?
Well, so, yeah, I mean, sort of more, but I'm talking about a specific fighter. If you're the number 100th middleweight in ranked by Fight Matrix, and you're 5-5 in your last 10 fights, or 4-6, it's hard to imagine anybody else paying as much as probably the UFC is going to pay you, because they have a set tier system. It's all a formula. You know, you're not, or even let's go lower than the 100th. Let's go the 200th fighter, right? You've been in the promotion for a while. You're not, I hate to say this, but you're not that good in the grand scheme of MMA. But, you know, compared to me, you're world class. But in the grand scheme of things, you're not that good. But the UFC has you on the roster, so you're making more than you would anywhere else. And the UFC, because they have all these services, they have all these people making sure you go to the right spot. They treat you, they treat the mid card guys kind of like main card guys and other cards by, you know, making sure they have transportation, doing all this stuff for you. You can understand why a lot of fighters enjoy being in the UFC compared to other places.
I guess so, but I don't know. It's a meat grinder. I'll never look at it any other way.
Oh,
thanks
the
a
whole
lot
sport's
for
a
that,
meat
John.
grinder. Yes, yeah. but the people. Then you here's a way to look at it too. The UFC has 20 people on a card, right? 20 fighters. Mm-hmm. They can pay the bottom 18 $1 million, which is much more than the undercard of or let's say the bottom 16, $1 million, much more than they would on any boxing card or other promotion. So those 16 fighters who together are making like 60, 70,000 each are very happy with the system. Now the top 4 guys, the UFC is going to pay them on this card $2 million. Or 1 million all together. Again, 4 fighters, 1 million, that's 250,000 each. But that's 1/3, 1/4, 1/5 what they would get in like boxing or another competitive market. So the bottom guys are making 5 times as much, and more of them are making more, but the top 4 are also making only 1/5 what they're getting. But the difference between that pay is vast because, 5 times $1 million is the UFC is paying an extra 800,000, but they're saving $8 million by cutting the cost of the top 4.
Jeez, man, always taking us out on a dismal note, John. You should be ashamed of yourself.
I'm sorry. Everybody should be very positive because there's some really great cards this week.
There really
This is
are.
an amazing week. One of the best weeks ever for fights. If you're a fight fan.
There sure are.
Yeah.
All right. So right now, what I want you to do is tell us what you got coming up.
Well, I've got I'm going to watch the Inoue fight.
Yep.
I got Spence Crawford for my other big fight of the week. I'm going to try to watch. I'll probably delay to watch the UFC because it's a good card, but the Spence Crawford's like a once in a decade
Spence
type fight.
Crawford actually comes on after UFC is over.
Really?
Yeah, I think the way that it worked out, that the main event will actually happen right after Gaethje and
because I think Spence but Spence Crawford starts at 5
I thought
PM.
That's when the undercard started. Oh no.
No, Spence Crawford starts at 5 early.
Oh, so it's okay. I just had it reversed.
Yeah, and then it might be over by the time we get to the main event, but then the Bellator card's pretty damn good too from Japan. So I'll probably I'll watch all of them, but the ones I'm really going to be watching live is on Saturday night is the Spence Crawford. And then at that point, I'm just going to see what's left to watch, what fights are available. And then I'll either switch over to the UFC or watch that the next day or the Bellator Ryzen show.
All right. Well, who you got? Who are you taking? Bud Crawford or Errol Spence?
Oh, this is man. I'm really.
I know. I've been back and forth about 800 times.
All the fights actually, because I'm really questionable. I'm taking Dustin over.
Oh, me too.
Gaethje, I think. Yeah, even though Dustin's, he's getting up there, but so is Gaethje. But I think Dustin will pull it off. I think I think I'm moving to Fulton now. I think I'm going Fulton.
Yeah,
I think
I've
we talked
already
about
gone
this.
Fulton. Yeah.
he just looks so much bigger, and it's just he is really, really good. And that's just, it might be one step too much for Inoue to do. But I'm slightly leaning towards Crawford. I'm really Crawford, again, older guy, but Crawford's just been a special talent for as long as I remember.
And I'm leaning Spence right now, but yesterday I was leaning Crawford. So by the time it happens, 14 more changes will happen. The
good news, I'm kind of fans of everybody.
Yeah.
So whoever wins, I'll kind of be, I'm also be sad because I'm kind of fans of everybody too. So, but it's not like one of those things that'll be crushed like the jerk one. I have no problem with any of these fighters. So.
Well, all right. So on that note, we're going to wrap it up. Do us a favor. Subscribe to Substack. Keep us in business. And if you're already a subscriber, share it with all your friends. We need all the help we can get. Follow this guy on Twitter at
You can just mail us envelopes of money too, if that works for you.
Yes. He's at Hey Not The Face. His messages are open. So if you have questions, message him or message myself. I'm at Crooklyn MMA. And you know the drill from here. Until next time, please stay safe.
Not in the face! Thank you.